Hi, I'm Chaplain Charlie Wharton with the St. Mary's County Sheriff's Office.
And I'm Chaplain Larry Crabtree with the St. Mary's County Sheriff's Office and the Maryland State Police.
Larry, over the last few months, one of the topics that has generated a lot of attention, not only in our community but around the nation, is the amount of violence that is going on. And we are struggling to try to come up with answers to address that violence. And sometimes we look at law enforcement, sometimes we look at our legislators, the judicial system. But I think that one of the places that we have to look is inside our faith-based communities, because that may be a key to turning this all around.
I agree with you, because when we talk about violence in our community, there is no one that has an easy answer to this. I don't think there's anyone that's a definitive expert. I think we're all very concerned. We're all very perplexed. But we all agree that it needs to stop. And I think one of the greatest places to go has to do with our faith, with our belief system, and really because we're talking about what's inside of us. Because I can't do a lot about out there, but I think we have control over how we each react. And so I think it's a good thing to talk about and discuss together a little bit. Maybe it'll help other people think and process some things in their own mind as well. So when we're talking about this whole concern about violence in our communities, I think it's important that we define that our concern is first of all for victims, because there's a lot of damage that's being done. Families are being ripped apart, lives are being taken, or lives are just being changed. So we're concerned about the victims. We are certainly, as police chaplains involved in law enforcement, we are greatly concerned about those men and women in law enforcement that have to respond directly into these violent situations. So we're concerned about their safety. We're concerned about the way it impacts them and the situations it places them in. But I think we're also concerned about, shall we say, the reputation of our community itself. Because if we're a community that's known as fighting, that's not a good thing to be known about. So these are some of the things that we recognize are at stake as we discuss this together.
And it's not just today. It is something that is very important for where we go from here. You know, when we were talking about this earlier and putting some thoughts together, we kept going back to the Old Testament in particular, and some of the struggles that the Jews had during the times really of the judges as well as the prophets. And the legacy that they left was not a good one. In fact, it was something that would eventually lead to the end of their dynasty that they knew.
In fact, I think from a spiritual perspective, the Scripture describes these revolving conflicts as everyone was doing what they thought was right in their own eyes. And I think that's an important statement, because really I think a lot of conflict and violence comes out of, it's my way, it's about me, it's very self-focused, and when we only care about ourselves, the consequences of that is going to be violence, fights, unhappiness, and pain.
When we talk about this, the easy part about it is to say there's something wrong. Yeah. All you have to do is pick up a newspaper or look at the statistics about the amount of violence. Johns Hopkins just did a huge project on the amount of gun violence that is going on in our nation. We need to look at something different, not just the numbers that are out there, but a look at what can we do to make a difference. One of my favorite quotes is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil over good is for good men to do nothing."
Do you know who said that? I have heard that before.
I've heard everybody from Mark Twain to Sir Edmund Burke. You know, it's one of those quotes that somebody somewhere said. Yeah. But it really is true, because if we're not going to make a difference, it's just going to keep getting worse. It's not going to get better on its own. So as good people, we have to stand up, we have to step forward and say, we're going to do something.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you saying, and I agree with that the first step is we need to acknowledge the problem and basically say we have a problem and that it's not okay. that something has to change.
And I'll say that right now. Okay,
Yeah,
let's just jump right through that. We got a problem.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that because we're not hearing a lot of people that say it. I think others think it's the police's problem, or it's their problem, or it's the commissioner's problem, or it's always somebody else's problem. But I agree. It needs to start with, no, it's actually my problem. I live here.
And unless we stand up and do something about violence, we are just as complicit in the damage that it does to the community as those who actually do it.
I agree. In fact, that's a biblical principle. The Bible makes it clear that if we see wrong, if we're watching it happen, we know of it, and if we idly stand by and do nothing, that we are as guilty as the person is actually doing it. So, Charlie, what then are some suggestions? What are some things perhaps we can be doing as a Christian community or as a faith-based community to address this? We talked about it's got to start with acknowledgement there's a problem and that we need to do something. So let's talk a little bit, just what are the suggestive things that we could do?
I think the number one thing, and it's one that is often overlooked, is do the right thing. Live by the laws of the nation. We have to be the ones that set the example of being law-abiding citizens and not hurting other people.
So am I hearing you say that adding more laws doesn't really fix anything? Because are we already obeying the ones that we have?
You know, if we're to take the laws that we have now and do those things, it's a pretty good place to live.
Yeah. Again, I think it's an inward problem, not a legislative problem. May I suggest another thing that we could do is how about we just begin to truly understand the value of human life? I think that's really important. When one individual in our community is hurt or killed, we all suffer because their life's important. And we need to, and that maybe if we understood the value of life, we'd stand up and say more because we recognize that I'm hurt by them being hurt.
One of the first concepts that we find in the Bible, in Genesis, is that every individual is made in the image of God.
Yeah.
From the very beginning, that is something that was vitally important to our Creator. And I think we miss sight of that. There are pockets that we talk about it in. You know, there are certain things that, we acknowledge it, but that must be acknowledged in every aspect of who we are. There is value in human life, no matter whose life it is.
And Jesus himself said that there is no greater love than that one would lay down their life for a friend. And so again, there's that idea the value of life is so great that I'm even willing to give mine for you, which I think that's a place to start. We need to recapture that again.
Another thing that we can do is to go back to the golden rule.
Yeah.
We do a pretty good job of protecting my rights and talking about my rights, but we need to, for lack of a better way of putting it, do unto others as you would like them do unto you. Because when we talk about violence, the reason that most people do violence is because it is what feels good to them.
Yeah.
It serves their own interest.
Yeah, again, it's that self-serving, self-focused attention.
Let's talk about this one. I've heard you talk about it quite a bit. The idea of holding people accountable for their actions.
When you see something that's wrong, you're witnessing something where someone's harming another, taking from another, where this self-focus is being very strongly demonstrated, I think we have a responsibility to hold that person accountable. And I'm not saying we're mean and nasty and, clamping down on everything we see, but it is the idea that there's accountability for our actions. There are consequences to every decision we make and every behavior that we're involved in. And I think sometimes in our community, there's too many excuses. And we're not taking responsibility for our own personal actions, nor are we holding others accountable for what they choose to do on their own. And I think simply we need to do that.
I'm going to start preaching here for just a second because that's an occupational hazard. But I think that there's two areas where this really needs to be identified. Number one, if you see something, say something.
Yeah.
It's not about selling people out. It's not about ratting people out. It's not about being a snitch. It's about being a good citizen, about being a good neighbor. But secondly, when we get the opportunity to step forward, and to hold people accountable, we need to do that even in jury duty.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, most people, it's like a dreaded word, jury duty. Like, oh no, it's such an inconvenience. And yet, when you stop to think about it, while it does take some time and it does cost, it is a privilege to, in our country, to be a man or a woman that can actually, sit in a courtroom and listen and pass wise, prudent judgments on actions and behaviors that have taken place.
We can't fuss about the legislatures, about the law enforcement, about the judicial system letting us down unless we are willing to go out there and be a key cog in that wheel. It's important to protect the rights of fellow citizens. But again, it's also important to come back to the idea of we need to be holding ourselves accountable by doing the right thing, and also holding our neighbors accountable, because when we do that, we overcome violence and we bring peace and justice back in the community. Thank you for being a part of our discussion today on how to stand up to, or maybe even how to stop some of the violence in our communities. As we go through this discussion, our number one goal is to make sure that our community is safe. And so, as we finish up, the way that we typically do,
Please be strong.
and be safe.